Okay, I'm going to elaborate on some themes that I don't think I emphasized enough. Having gone through the process of making that last recording, and then going over my notes, I think I've perhaps got a hold of the. I mean, it is very difficult to kind of probe these ideological waters and come up with something that is universally sounding and appealing and in terms of it being convincing to potentially people who are in the other camp. And I take a liberty to kind of extend some of my descriptions and illustrations, which it's unfortunate that because I mean, trying to pin down the many-headed hydra of identity politics in its sort of half-baked primordial conception, it obviously can be done many different ways. You want to do it well enough that you can create things that people can identify as representative of what's going on within these belief structures. Anyway, let me get into some of the substance. I always try to make summary headings of my arguments, and that probably is not helpful to the listener. But my style of discourse is very top down, and that is off-putting to some, I imagine. But anyway, I am synthesizing this as I'm speaking, so it's not that fluid. But yeah, so what I have been trying to better deconstruct and better kind of map out, because I do think that my form of analysis does offer a lot better insight into what is actually going on in terms of this ideological machine and how it functions, and it does give a lot of insight into why, as a kind of ideological animal, it makes the moves that it makes, and it sort of develops almost along a pre-programmed path, and that is because of certain fundamental philosophical positions that it has taken within itself, and trying to cash those out, as I say, in a way that's universally convincing, is difficult, especially because it's so emotionally charged for so many people. But what I wish that I had emphasized more on is, and I think a lot of what I said in the earlier thing, it kind of alludes to this, but it almost would have been better if I had inserted even more consequences to certain, that I try to create explanations of what these things cause in terms of what effects are produced by those ideological positions. So I'm trying to remember how I referred to it in the last recording when I got to the point in which I did talk about perverse incentives. In that, and I want to redraw this topic because it is I think the first sticking point that you have when you're trying to confront someone who comes from this worldview. The first fact that they will rely on is that there's an environmental condition which is imposed on them, and which is almost historically inherited, and they will just simply table thump that fact of this ideological condition, which deprives them of moral agency effectively. Now, in a lot of ways, individuals don't have agency in the realm of which was mapped out by one of the presenters, in the kind of in the field of social conservatism. You're not able to safeguard and ensure and entrench and freeze certain the value that you have for certain ties or something like that, because they can be more there can be stronger prevalent forces at work that are almost have to do with trends that are kind of supervening, and it's not as if you are defeated by those supervening forces, but you have to kind of find a way to engage with them. And I would say it's better to do so intellectually honestly, and not create an antidote that is worse than the thing that you're solving, or that you're attempting to immunize yourself from. But okay, so this is getting tangential, but what I wanted to point out was that what is often it's very easy to get other people to resonate with this kind of fact that as an individual you are somewhat impotent or ineffectual at asserting agency in a way that can surmount some challenges and issues, and that really has to do with also how you choose to how you choose to select the narratives in which you're seeing yourself as a contender within. So sorry, I've just got the phrase that I was looking for that I wrote in my notes. As all individuals can be seen as powerless and impotent in a great many selection of narratives. Okay. And that is almost a fact of life, that one can never, so the idea that you're going to never be prone to a particular selection of narratives, you don't have to feel victimized in that. You can simply take a different conceptual stance, essentially, and stop trying to resist things and instead try to transform them from like a dispositional conservative point of view. Anyway, so I think that what is often happening in identity politics is in that all individuals can be powerless in this way, but that is dishonestly aggregated into this a narrative of group entities and collective identities. In that, and I do think that this is a very primordial sort of intellectual dishonesty, that because there's because this idea that certain individuals feel powerless, as all individuals are definitely powerless in some aspect, depending on your selection of narratives. But then there's there's a specious retraction from moral agency that you can contemplate from an individual perspective that suddenly pertains to the whole group. And that is definitely specious, especially in the modern South African context. The idea that a poor black man or woman or boy or girl, a young person, a very young person who hasn't even finished school, the idea that they don't feel in control of society. I mean, to kind of to sort of caricature that position of helplessness, and to kind of hang it all on a historical set of facts, which somehow the history gets chopped up. That, you look at all the history before 1994 and you just ignore all the history after 1994. That's what I call specious. And the idea that, oh, well, because, this is what I wanted to emphasize in terms of the perverse incentive that the ideology breeds, in that it kind of promotes this self-antagonism and this, so that one can identify with the with that general theme, which really undergirds and underpins the whole machinery of identity politics. Is the kind of the collective loss of moral authority, which means that essentially you can, instead of moral authority, you can speak for, instead of your own moral agency, which you're using to change society or using to speak in society. You're not going to speak on behalf of your moral agency. You're going to speak on behalf of the social justice of everyone. So you're going to be a voice for justice. You're not going to be a voice for moral agency. And so I think that that is quite a disembodied voice to take. Because in a sense, you're speaking for everyone, including the perpetrator. And in fact, that is why there is such a big push, essentially, to repress the opponent and such. And it comes from an intrinsically fascistic mentality, in that us as individuals are powerless, so we need to band together, like we need to tie the strands in a bundle. Where we cannot be broken individually, we need to come together in a bundle that's fashioned together. Now, and in some sense, what is being bundled together is this wholesale lie of this kind of this general sense of moral unaccountability, which then is why the discourse of justice is employed. Now, because they use the discourse of justice, this is why I am so... I do believe that the law needs to be used to limit identity politics, especially because it's so intellectually destitute. It is naked fascistic reasoning, and although there is a strain of identity politics which is not overtly fascistic, I call it proto-fascism, which was the same kind of progressive consciousness that the Nazis used to destabilize Weimar Germany. It was, when you looked at the Nuremberg dissatisfaction marches, which were mainly had left-wing people, and it had lots of different flags. They weren't just the Nazi flags. There were lots of communistic flags, and there were lots of gay and the liberation is the same kind of liberation that's on the because when you've got a scapegoat that you can blame everything on, it's very easy to imagine whatever you wish. That you've essentially got a thorn in your foot, and it's as simple as discarding the thorn, and then you get to live happily ever after. That's what the kind of the ideological reduction somewhat does boil down to. But you see, the binding force of coming together and then having some kind of protection that the group will foster and will provide to the individual because of the weakness that is being imposed on it by some evil force, which is history in this case. That is a kind of, well, it's a lingering history, So, they have a lot of conceptual categories that kind of bleed into one another. So they have the same fuzzy thinking that kind of sometimes they will concede the point in one category just so that they can guarantee winning the point in the other category, and because it's the same conceptual tactic essentially, they don't mind doing this, and this is also why they why when you confront them on the practical side, they will concede, yes, these issues are very complicated, they're very hard, they're very challenging to overcome, and then they will just kind of sit there without a solution. But yet they will intrinsically endorse because the one binding thing that they can all agree on essentially is that as long as you are taking something from the historical cause, as long as you're causing some kind of discharge of what is the claim or the accusation that kind of premises the whole platform of identity politics. So as long as you're doing something that supposedly discharges the original evil, the historical evil, so it just so happens that you need to find a way to summon that into the present. You need to find a way to project that onto the present. And at the same time, this obviously has a very disruptive effect on seeing what's really going on and seeing what the real present challenges are, because they can only ever be called challenges if they are echoes of that historical paradigm and that historical mythology, in fact. And it does become, and I'm using mythology in the sense of that it is the basis of this revenge religion, and that religion and that revenge is the path to salvation. Revenge is the mode of progress. I'm talking a bit all over the place, but let me so and you see this playing itself over and over again, especially with the so you want to call the modern South African context some kind of iteration of colonialism. Essentially this is exactly you are trying to import the past into the present so that it can be adopted to lean on as a pervasive moral claim that then deserves a guardian to arbitrate the solution over the present. So you can get your dictator, you can get your authoritarian, you can get your revenge policy, you can get your government policy to overtly inflict some kind of revenge mechanic, never mind at what cost to the general potential in the system, which has been thwarted pretty thoroughly. The kind of we have instead developed identity consciousness when we could have developed an actual functioning economy that grew. We've had such pathetic growth for a developing country. You can't call us a developing country effectively. We have been arrested by these ideologues and this ideological corruption now. And so they will continue to make the same arguments when these sorts of arguments are in fact the arguments of identity politics are exactly why we are in the mess that we are and why we have not made the progress that we could have made. We have made a little bit of progress, but it really is pathetic compared to where we could have been if we didn't have this kind of ideological sabotage. But you see, this is something that you can't even bring up to these people because they just don't have any accountability. In fact, their whole schema is invested effectively in taking on the voice of justice and taking on the role of playing some kind of the divine representative of justice on earth, which is why also they make so many weird, almost occult or spiritual, kind of weird things. They kind of employ this idea that they have some kind of divinity about them. That they are doing this work because it's part of this kind of collective progress of this collective soul of this racial consciousness. It really does become a religion of racialism, which, I mean, that's already bare, it's laid bare to witness. And it's, in as much as it's seen as a means to an end. Technically within its own structures, it seems to a means as an end, but it won't. But it becomes its means becomes its end. It does somewhat make that transition where it becomes a perpetual revolution. It becomes a perpetual radical civil war, where you have to constantly ideologically police the health of the identity, and this becomes more important than the health of the people themselves. It becomes more important than the development of the country, is this sustaining their identity, as is often the case when you're dealing with slave morality, which is a Nietzschean conception, but yeah, so it is interesting that when essentially they complain of these sort of table-thumped facts about these conditions which have removed their moral agency, and then they then conflate that individual feeling of that things are not under their control. That means that things are not under the control of blackness, and blackness is being taken advantage of. There are whole orders of magnitude of conflation and jumping to So I mean, I guess their kind of their brute justification for this is that, well, how else are we going to make things better? Never minding witnessing that it has been this form of politics essentially that has allowed things to not be addressed. It has that it does start with a kind of affirmation of your own self-determinism and agency, but that is hard for a lot of people to move into that level of consciousness. Because then you don't have this appeal of this mainstream movement of moving with the tides, of being part of this current of history or something like that, which is always has been the seduction and the allure of the fascistic mentality. Hitler had this thing about 1,000 years Reich or whatever. That is the wavelength that these people are on. They are already cultural fascists. Okay, sorry, I wanted to also expand on why I think that it is necessary to make a legal test and to remove this sort of poison from academia. I mean, first of all, it's so intellectually thin. Like they are just, if you follow their kind of their charged labeling system, and their terminology, and you kind of decode it. It works on a kind of tautological thing, but because they're fuzzy about a few things, they can always kind of generate more useless observations, but they're all observations that land up in the same sort of intellectual bin of contentions and issues that are raised, and essentially this becomes the fuel for setting up a state that is not run on the rule of law, and that is run kind of as as an ad hoc. You need these little chieftains all over the place. You need these administrators that are essentially not following rules, but are in fact making the rules up as they go along and creating specific solutions in very, so they're constantly arbitrating. So in fact, you've got a system of magistrates. Now, this does not even work. Okay, like this only works if you have one identity. And even that is not psychologically sustainable. Like this definitely does not work in terms of intersectionality. There is no way in hell that you would have a state that would be able to stabilize its own policy, trying to cater to more than one set of relativistic concerns, because every identity is going to have its own mythology that it has to kind of instantiate the primacy thereof, and to kind of push it and integrate integrated in the sense that you always have to translate what is essentially the tendency within the ideology, which is that it has to create access to damaging the scapegoat. It has to create access to it is a form of sort of ideological parasitism, because they only have a claim of justice so much as they have an evil perpetrator, and so this is why it often becomes very sophisticated, and why they talk about colonialization of the mind, because in the same way that in Nazi Germany they had to completely reinvent the Jewish conspiracy multiple times just to keep the engine running, as it were, because in a sense you have no standing to be an agent other than through this kind of reactionary defense against there is a fundamental asymmetry within. I mean, there are multiple asymmetries within the ideological setup in which they can't be the prime mover, and they dangle that as a carrot. They say, no, after we go through some kind of historical adjustment, then we'll be remade on the other side of it, or something like that. So I mean. And then they go to war with themselves, on themselves, because social justice will always be to the exclusion of private coordination, because of being under the aegis of the guardian. And because it doesn't work without the operation of a guardian principle, you need a guardian that is of one mind and doesn't have multiple nodes of disagreement. And this is why essentially it will have to boil down into one identity, and this is why Hitler talks about betraying the useful idiots that went along with him, and that basically spread his fascistic ideals so well in the culture of Weimar Germany. I'm just going to read through some of my notes because I'm afraid that I'm probably not making a broad enough analysis as I should. Defending against them requires building a working model of their ideology just to precisely exclude it, or that which is problematic, because their thinking is built on false equivalencies, conflating issues of composition with substantive claims or assumptions. And I think they often do this by using words which also mean their opposite. And what I mean by that is socially constructed identifiers. To rely on an identifier which they claim is socially constructed is intrinsically that I think is the root of much of the double standards and hypocrisy which you see manifest in the ideology. So triggering an antagonistic defensiveness that merely mimics the position which underpins the source of the ideological accusation. So the stance that they take in being defensive against the evil is, ironically, mimics the very thing that they consider evil. So and then you get the weird thing where whiteness is evil, but blackness is good. So like whiteness is a social construct, but that because it's labeled as being oppressive, then therefore, so essentially it's nothing because it's just socially constructed. It can be socially deconstructed, but the process for deconstructing it must somehow be blackness and is good. There's definitely a whole. There's a jump that is happening there, which is since whiteness is perpetrating this on us, why not embrace what they are imposing on us? So they're basically saying we don't actually have a racial consciousness, it's being imposed on us from the outside, so let's just adopt it anyway and use that to reframe the system internally by some kind of revenge mechanic, which is, it's decadent to say the least. It's not necessary to do that. It's quite a weird, elaborate, and irregular. Why wouldn't non-racialism be much better at deconstructing these things? So even though both are just social constructs, whiteness and blackness, but because of the of the formula racism equals power plus oppression, then they've got this reinterpreted language in which they can kind of co-opt and toxically unhinge, the basis of principle in which we can even notice if there is any kind of improvement or how to design solutions. That vision is completely removed when you've got this. Okay. I've been trying to work out preemptively or preliminarily. I've tried to work out how to work out some kind of legal test that you could ask of a work, of an academic project or paper, to work out if it would fail a legal test, and that what one could, because we are not free in the realm of moral claims and moral. We are not free to use our moral agency to concoct any moral schema that we're allowed to act on and behave. We live in a society that has laws. And you cannot incite people to hate speech, and I would say also that you cannot incite people effectively to undermine the Constitution, not at least the foundational values. Because essentially, racialism is essentially propaganda for civil war. So at that point, even if I think we have in South Africa perhaps even started to cross this line, that. The constitutional dispensation has been so badly damaged by this political faction, which seems only to be gaining ground, and also because there has been no political force that has actually debunked it and confronted it directly and deconstructed it, which is very problematic. but I mean, I would say essentially de facto there has already been moves towards a civil war, and that by the Constitutional Review Committee that has effectively been tasked to remove non-racialism from the Constitution in regards to Section 25. It is an obvious attempt to see how much Parliament can debase the Constitution and remove its foundational values for this black nationalistic element in our political economy. And essentially we've had such a weak president that he's not been able to actually, I mean, non-racialism is no longer in the discourse of the ANC, the ruling party. So, I mean, I think I don't have to say more than that. But this is somewhat problematic because it does already essentially threaten we have effectively I don't know how to describe this accurately because, I mean, it hasn't happened all the way yet, but, I mean, effectively, we are running off of the fumes of the ethics of the 90s, which has no contenders in the moral political space. Essentially, we've got mainstream journalists that are essentially an echo chamber for the most vile fascistic propaganda and rhetoric that just essentially mirrors the talking points of identity politics. And no one is sort of taking this stuff well, I mean, it's not as if no one is taking it seriously. I mean, certainly, but I mean, no one in any official capacity has done anything. I mean, I can make a technical legal argument anyway. It's a bit tangential. I'm not going to go into it. About what would potentially be a responsible reaction to these new political events, effectively. That obviously would potentially muddy the waters, and it would give the fascists exactly what they wanted, the kind of excuse they needed to move forward with their disgusting designs. But anyway, and to fuel their base, which, anyway, the candidate question that I've just been musing on or whatever is this is going to sound a bit weird, but does it profess to construct knowledge of some identifier, as in like a socially constructed identifier, after the presumption of sameness? So, if you want to construct knowledge about some kind of distinguishing identifier and then presume that that identifier should have the sameness in outcome or something like that, implies that you will always find evidence that can be attributed to social injustice. So if that is your formula of your hypothesis that you're making a paper on, you're obviously going to come up with you're going to come up with differences, and those differences are all going to be suggested to be attributable to differences because of social injustice. Now, the Constitution itself talks about social injustice, and what it's actually referring to is a limitation on state actions and powers against socially defined identifiers. So, and in some sense, because of the kind of the trickery that happens within that weird container of socially defined identifiers. because the kind of saying that they're socially defined is basically saying that they are intrinsically meaningless, or they should, at least on the abstract level, they are without merit. But yet they embrace identifiers like blackness. They embrace as more than a means to an end. That is what it always develops into. That the label of blackness is not being embraced as a means to an end. That is not how it is adopted. It is adopted like that in terms of some of the technical rhetoric. That is not how it's relied on. And it very obviously becomes an end in itself, and that is racial fascism, racially defined fascism. Fascism has always needed to ground itself generally in some form of ethnicity, because otherwise it doesn't have fascism, in some sense, could only ever hope to somewhat have a healthy culture if it was incredibly okay, if you reduce it to something like social conservatism in a very kind of loose and vague and weak version of itself, and that you could call as like the social fabric on some level, and I do think that, I mean, this is, you could call it like a general sense of morality, and that is usually the kind of the sense of some sense of social cohesion, which is obviously problematic in South Africa, but it's been exacerbated by, I would say, irresponsible government and ideological corruption, and obviously a problematic and difficult history, and the effects of that history, which needs to be tackled. And the kind of but now, because of the gerrymandering over the process of tackling that, that speciously divides moral accountability into being concentrated in a minority within a country, while at the same time pointing to statistics which don't even look at absolute numbers. They only look at like per capita and average income. Which is obviously also exacerbated by, it would be very interesting to see, like, if you look at the top people in each race and then compare their wealth or something like that, it might be quite surprising. I mean, there are a lot of class issues which are completely being turned into fodder for what has been going on and what seems to will be what continues to go on if the EFF and the ANC get into some kind of coalition. Which is effectively political elites at the government trough. But yeah, I mean, sorry, my notes, I guess, are a bit vague here. So, but basically, the biggest problem is that the social justice is a negative value system. They know what they don't want, but they have no conception of what they do want, other than the absence of things that they don't want, i.e., inequality. And that almost has a promise built in within itself that it has so much sophisticated measurements or something like that that have to be catered to and that have to be balanced and have to be juggled. And so it's just like it becomes a practical or pragmatic issue which you have to believe can be orchestrated by a concentrated intervention and a kind of systematic rubric which is placed over society. And as soon as you buy into that model, although it's easy to imagine that that should be able to deliver, all you are delivering on is a kind of perpetual removal of accountability. And the promise is that one day you'll be strong enough that you can be given moral agency and accountability and self-determinism, but that happens after some kind of intermediate stage. I mean, ironically, the best way to do this is to have a government that, is embracing of the market and that is focusing on education instead of squandering money and, in fact, purposefully keeping people underdeveloped so that they can secure their rural voting blocks, like in that scandal in which textbooks which they had were not delivered on purpose to rural schools. It's and never mind the vast moves forward that we could have if we had something like a voucher system for schooling, that people could perhaps get a taste of accountability and making choices. Yeah, and also entrepreneurship, of seeing where you can add value to other people's lives and creating a business out of it. But that is unlikely to happen with the conditions that we have. And the ANC has really been good at promoting this idea of that government needs to do more, which essentially dries up all other sources of opportunity just because of, literally it's in the word, just because of the kind of the tax that is the tax to the general system in that it's not, but you see, this I also am quite pessimistic about, is that I don't see that we're going to have a credible political shift that reestablishes sanity in any of these issues. And with the lack of that, even if you did fix the policy, I wonder if you can repair the trust. Because, essentially the demons have been let loose, and they have, and in fact, they're not even going to shut up anytime soon. So, we've literally got the black reincarnation of Hitler, Julius Malema. And in a polity that can't even subtract that out and find a way to actually defend its own principled existence. And it won't even take a stand. It won't even have the uncomfortable confrontations. I mean, yes, it does feed into their rhetoric. It does, fascists are very good at choosing who they engage with. they don't want to engage with people that are actually capable of debunking them. They only want, they essentially want a puppet stooge that they can kind of mockingly get into intellectual fights with, so that they can embolden their sense of self-righteousness, so that they can say, oh, these people just don't understand. They're trying to attack our guardians, but they don't understand that we actually have a fundamental claim that these conditions are just intolerable. And so, it's just so evil that we should do anything, never mind if that makes the situation worse or better, or never mind the other alternative routes and possible solutions. And certainly never mind taking accountability and seeing that the state of the country, if you are going to believe in collective identities, then you have to say that the biggest the biggest disaster that this country has had is this idea of blackness, essentially. Now, it's not offensive in my mind to say, because I'm a non-racialist, and I think that if people are offended by that statement, they are literally the problem. Like, their consciousness, their mentality, they are what has delivered this to us. They should look inwards, not look for scapegoats outwards. And obviously, as an individual, with this new consciousness that I'm advocating, if you adopt that, that doesn't give you an easy solution, but you have at least one less wrong, easy solution that essentially is just going to lead us down the road towards Zimbabwe. We literally have examples of this same insanity on our doorstep, and still, essentially the emotional argument, and because we have no one with any backbone in the official political space standing up against this. Even if you do it wrongly, with enough humility, you can get through their linguistic problems. You just if you apologize for the version of the counter accusation that they make against you, you accept their label, but you continue to make the same point. You continue to reiterate the exact same point that you were making, and you show them how their labeling system effectually. It's just noise. It's just nonsense. It's just another permutation of the same doublespeak, of the same, either we're going to complain about how sorry we feel for our collective identity, and then the other day we're going to talk about, if these people in our country don't adopt all the accountability and they don't take on this role of being the scapegoat, that obviously that's why we are not making progress, is because these people aren't absorbing the accountability that we won't collectively adopt, but that we will kind of administrate as the voices of justice. And where does that disembodied identity infantilism, where does it take you? It takes you down the road of having a very strong identity and having a very weak country and a very weak civil society and a very weak individual. It doesn't matter what color they are, and you've got a very weak, a fascistic, authoritarian constitution and a system of government. And essentially, when you think the wrong thing, then they will have their revolutionary police coming to defend the revolution and to lock you up. It's incredibly disgusting. Right. Every time earlier that I said socially constructed, I should have rather said socially defined, because that actually gets the, I mean, it's perhaps the same notion, but that makes it at least more clear as to the kind of inherent cognitive dissonance that they have at the bedrock of these are the subject of the whole ideological enterprise that they have going. Socially defined identifiers. Oh, yeah, so you have to create. I would say if you're going to create a legal test, it would have to be around sort of working out the different ways of testing for if a project is kind of centered around doing something specific with a socially defined identifier, which has this weird conflation between some kind of characteristic fact and some kind of a social construction about that group, which then kind of gets mingled in with the fact, and so then that creates a kind of almost like it's almost like an empirical formula that will lead to a certain disequilibrium that has to be answered with some kind of reaction. It's almost mathematical, and I do have other notes here that actually goes into some of the other. But yeah, I mean, it says social justice in the Constitution, but I mean, the basic purport of it is that the concept of social injustice is a limitation on state actions and powers, which would be against socially defined identifiers. So I would say it precludes this notion of social justice. It social justice is kind of mentioned only in kind of preamble type stuff and kind of general headings that frame things. But when you actually get to affirmative action, it literally says previously disadvantaged, and with all the surrounding context, that has been horribly abused to include people that are no longer disadvantaged, and the fact that they were previously disadvantaged is irrelevant. And effectively, it should all be any kind of benefit should be on the basis of some kinds of means test. Any kind of, and then perhaps if we redress the system like that, we would get a much more effective form of affirmative action that would not seek to essentially completely destabilize any kind of institutional functionality and just sort of tax a system with this ideological tax that makes it impossible for the economy and commerce to function, essentially, under the weight of these mandates and these sort of double standards all over the place. Which become an unsustainable thing, which is effectively what the fascist state somewhat promises to put a identitarian arbiter on the corner of every street to tell people how they should look at each other and how they should glance at each other and for what time periods and in what ways, and to kind of coordinate every aspect of human life into some kind of equal outcome of racial pride and group pride that somehow has to be measured and monitored and filtered according to some kind of equal distribution. I mean, if you actually take it to its conclusion, you realize just how demeaning and dehumanizing this form of so-called solution, just how monstrous, it and effectively you can only get to that state of sophisticated controls because you've got you on the back of an argument that when people aren't glancing at each other in the way that they're supposed to in a properly distributed way, that there is some hysterical emotional charge about an accusation that attaches this mythological, historical paradigm that is so relativistic, essentially, and it basically trying to make relativistic claims into some kind of permanency, which cannot be done through proper law. So it has to be done through administrators. It has to be done through what effectively becomes a police state. I mean, obviously, a lot of people say, well, now, your descriptions go much too far. We would stop before then. But, because it forces you to fudge their solution, because their solution is so, let's say, it is a form of justifiable revenge, as that's kind of how it's supposed to work, is that it's a means to an end and then it should stop. But then I'll just literally say, well, I mean, at least if you follow the conceptual argument that whiteness and blackness aren't some technical, abstract place, are both things that should go to the wayside of history, that should be over and finished with at some point. Even if you accept that, do you really see this rhetoric of blackness? Do you really see it dissipating? Do you really see that it's going to be as vicious and equal as white supremacy was, and then at that same point that it reaches the same level of hate, that it will cancel each other out? That the historical charge will have been cancelled out by this new wave of black redemptionism. I mean, it's fucking insane. It's stupid. I mean, that is a stupid notion to think that. I mean, how would that be the appropriate solution? It does not even make sense, especially with the delusion that it requires to get into that mindset. So people are going to be very careful about actually fixing practical problems while they are just basically trying to make sure that black does better than white to compensate for the past. I mean, this is, I mean, a lot of the time, I mean, this is the problem with this ideology is that it's purely moralistic and it has absolutely no contact with reality and like commerce and economic issues. It's just anyway, I've gone on much too long. I don't think I'm going to upload this one, but anyway.